Hey, my name is Steven. I'm not from here, from Nova Scotia, so it's for me just so inspiring to be in a room of folks doing so much great work already on decarbonization here in Newfoundland and Labrador. But there's been lots of talk on the offshore in oil and gas and on the 1.5 degree target that we're all holding ourselves to. And they're, of course, just not compatible. A doubling of the offshore is in no way compatible with the 1.5 degree future. So I'm wondering if there is, as someone who's not from here, if there is already active campaigning and challenging that expansion of offshore oil and gas, and if not, should there be?
Do you want to go ahead?
I was just going to say, yes, there friggin' should be.
So I have a scientist answer, but I have an organizer answer, because I'll give the organizer answer because I've been asked this pretty much every single media interview. And my answer has been that we organized this space to be agnostic about how to achieve the carbon goals. I did some back of the envelope calculation, and I think you can do it if like everything else is literally zero carbon in the province. You can get close to that target. If that's the decision we want to make, we need to be spending billions and billions and billions of dollars outfitting every home with, and bikes everywhere and public transit. So the transformation is that much more extreme if we consider that industry to be sacred. And so that's the answer that I've given, and I encourage everyone to think about how we get to that point.
Yeah, I think for us, it's a good question. It's a very broad question, but one of the objectives we had coming into this event was we were looking for targets and ways to really hit the federal framework. So I think Karen addressed it very well in his presentation. But what we've seen in other jurisdictions is the electrification, our ability to proliferate. We have some surplus power as well. So the more we can proliferate the power that we have, electrify some of these developments, we can drive down some of the emissions targets. I realize that doesn't exactly answer your question, but I just wanted to share with you just from a practical perspective some of the things that we wanted to try to glean out of the event. So it's not the satisfactory answer for you. I realize that, and I think when we provide some of the feedback from some of the breakout session, I think there is probably some good feedback from that perspective. But yeah, I think it's going to be a difficult one. It's certainly one that we that's going to take a much more broader discussion.
Got to have my 2 cents about this as well in this forum. Newfoundland and Labrador is, I would say, inextricably tied to the oil and gas industry in terms of our economic situation and our reliance. And I think that doubling oil production, while it might look good on paper right now, is not in any way the path we need to go, even just for pure economic reasons. Being tied to an industry that's so volatile, and even leaving the decarbonization question to the side, being so tied to an industry that's so volatile, it doesn't make economic sense for our province. We need to diversify. We need to be less tied to something that will have such a serious impact on our bottom line with even a $10 drop per barrel in the price of oil. And the volatility is only increasing as conversations about climate change go forward, and it's very uncertain what the future will hold. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, our reliance on oil is going to go well into the future, and it's important that that oil that we use is developed in a place that has strong environmental regulations. But you know what? I've traveled a lot. I know a lot of people from other countries where they hear the exact same thing. So I think it's really important, obviously, to decarbonize. This is something that we need to do to ensure that we have a future, but also as a way to provide prosperity for our province. Newfoundland and Labrador needs to focus on our other strengths and on other ways to build jobs, industry. For example, MISA is a company that started with a very innovative idea and has been really successful in growing that company and that business. Other companies like Verafin, they're focused on technology. We need to focus on things we can do here and what our strengths are in order to decrease that tie to this industry and stop just doing the same things the way we've always done them. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, we raise the paradox here of how do we double oil and gas production and decarbonize. And you know, we ask the question, I think a lot of people don't realize that when they calculate greenhouse gas emissions for this province, the only fossil fuels that they include are those that are combusted here. So basically, if it's not combusted here, if we export it, it's somebody else's problem, right? Which is how, so if you don't take that into account, right, then essentially, you know, we're exporting greenhouse gases that are going to come back to us and everybody else globally with profound effects. And it also affects, as somebody argued at our table, you know, how do we credibly stand up and tell the rest of the world to do without because of climate change when we're doubling our oil and gas production? And you know, so I mean, I think we have to name this. We have to basically fully include all of the greenhouse gas emissions. If you're actually going to get the political requirement to do what Brett suggested, as long as we can export that responsibility, then we can look clean when we're not clean at all. And I think the only other thing I'll say is that probably 3 years ago, we had a conference at Memorial called basically, how do we get to a post-oil dependent Newfoundland and Labrador? You know, and we produced a major report from that. And part of the whole argument there was that we need a different kind of economy. Right? That we need an economy that's inclusive, that we need to value sectors, that we put so much of our resources and time into big energy. And look where it's gotten us. It's not just oil and gas that's produced vulnerability, but Muskrat Falls has produced enormous vulnerability so that we will have to sacrifice social programs, education, et cetera, to pay that debt. This is catastrophic. You know, and what we had argued for was investing in human creativity, not in you know, human energy, the capacity of our people, being more inclusive, engaging people with disabilities, building more livable communities, all of those things, a different approach to education. You know, and so those ideas are out there. People have thought about this, but it's bigger than decarbonizing. It's like, let's do this differently.
Just a quick thing, let's get rid of the GDP model of economic well-being.
Stephen, I think the question that you ask really gets to the core of why we held this event. I mean, the province's plan for economic prosperity right now is to double offshore oil production by 2030, and we know that's simply incompatible with climate science. We know that 4/5 of the world's fossil fuel reserves, proven reserves, have to stay in the ground to have a reasonable chance of maintaining climate targets. We also know that there's no point for any new exploration because what we already know exists has to stay in the ground. So why are we setting a goal to drill 100 offshore oil wells? That being said, I don't think this challenge is insurmountable. We know from the IPCC report that we essentially need to reduce the amount of primary energy derived by oil by 37% by 2030. Why don't we make that our policy goal, not a 100% increase? Let's have a managed decline of 37% by 2030. That doesn't feel like a super radical goal to me. Now, it also increases to 80% by 2050, which is a little bit more tough, but I believe we can get there. I truly think that the goal of this conference was kind of offer an alternative to doubling offshore oil production, and instead use the ideas across all the sessions to build a truly just, sustainable, and equitable future. And I think if we took the biggest policy recommendation that comes out of each session, be it fisheries and aquaculture, or transportation, or electricity, or food, that we can very easily reach and exceed that 37% target. My only ask for the province, for organizations, for businesses, is not to be radical and for a radical transformation, but simply to make decisions which are compatible with climate science.
I'm just going to add to, just to think about this, when we're talking about moving away from oil and gas, I think it's very careful that we don't greenwash things like Muskrat Falls and ignore the very serious harms that they're causing. You know, in particular, like my community downstream from Muskrat Falls, we're, you know, threatened by methylmercury contamination, which is a very serious thing, and it's threatening our culture as Inuit. So I think, you know, there's a lot of really interesting discussions around the economics of things like this, but I just want us to also center people and make sure that we don't, when shifting away from oil, looking at renewable energy, don't ignore the people and the effects of things like mega dams.